Hello, Dunlap family. Welcome back. We are going to be reading more Wishtree, and we are starting in chapter 31. I haven't always been a Wishtree. It happened in 1848, long before I was surrounded by concrete and cars, when I was just a few decades old, still a youngster by Red Oak standards. No longer a lanky sapling, I was solid and strong, but not anchored to the earth the way I am now. This was a time, like many other times, when hungry, desperate people sailed on crowded boats to settle here. Many of them ended up, as they always seem to, in my neighborhood. The blue and green houses were brown then and filled to overflowing with new arrivals. Sometimes the newcomers were welcomed, sometimes they were not, but still they came, hoping and wishing as people always do. One of our new residents was a young Irish girl named Maeve. She voyaged across the Atlantic with her 19-year-old brother, who died of dysentery during the trip. Their mother had passed away shortly after Maeve was born, their father when the children were 9 and 12. Maeve was solid and plain, but when she smiled, it was like sunshine peeking through the clouds. She had a deep laugh, and her hair was as brilliantly red as my finest autumn attire. 16, alone and penniless, Maeve shared a tiny room with 5 other immigrants. She worked night and day, cleaning and cooking and doing whatever she could to stay alive. Maeve soon discovered she was gifted at caring for the sick. She had no special knowledge, no secret remedies, but she was kind and patient, and she knew how to soothe a fevered brow with a cool cloth as well as anyone. What she didn't know, she was willing to learn. As time passed, word grew of Maeve's abilities. People brought their sick piglets and their lame horses, their coughing children and fretful babies. Always she explained that she wasn't sure she could help, but since people in the neighborhood were too poor to go to a doctor, they turned to Maeve. And since people believed she could help them get better, Maeve tried to live up to their hopes. When she succeeded, and even when she didn't, patients and their families would leave small tokens for her. A widowed figurine of a bird, a hairpin, half a loaf of bread. Once someone even left a leather-covered journal with a tiny silver key that opened its lock. When Maeve was out tending to someone who was sick, people took to leaving their thank yous in my lowest hollow. It was still a fresh wound, just a couple of seasons mended, but because it faced the house where Maeve roomed and not the street, it was a safe place to leave a token of gratitude. That's when I realized that hollows can be a good thing for people, not just birds and animals. Little did I know just how good. Chapter 32. The years passed and Maeve became as connected to the neighborhood as I was. Even as newcomers from other lands added their music and food and language to our little part of the world, no matter where people came from, Maeve cared for them as best she could. I grew tougher, my older limbs less pliable, my shadow longer. More trees and shrubs joined me, but there was plenty of sun for all of us, and we never wanted for water. I'd hosted many families by then, mice and chipmunks in particular. My closest confidant was a young gray squirrel named Squibbles. All squirrel names begin with the letters SQU. Squibbles was especially fond of Maeve, who often fed the little squirrel table scraps. Privately, Squibbles and I worried about Maeve. Along the way, Maeve had seen a suitor or two, but nothing much came of those flirtations. She had friends aplenty and work to do from dawn to dusk. Still, she seemed lonely. Sometimes Maeve would sit on the porch steps, watching happy families stroll past, and her eyes would well up with tears. At night, she'd gaze out an open upstairs window, and her sighs would float to us on the breeze, melancholy as the call of a mourning dove. Often, Maeve would sit at the base of my trunk and write in her journal. Now and then she'd read passages aloud. She spoke about the Irish countryside fading into fog. She spoke about her family she'd lost. She spoke about her secret hopes and fears and longings. She had love to give, and no one to give it to. Maeve adored early mornings when the world was bathed in mist and the sun was still a promise. She would lean against my trunk and close her eyes and hum a little tune from her childhood. One day, the first day of May, Maeve joined me at dawn. To my surprise, she reached up to my lowest bough and gently tied a scrap of blue striped fabric in a careful knot. "I wish," she whispered, "for someone to love with all my heart." That was my first wish, and the beginning of many more. Chapter 33. As the weeks passed, the piece of fabric on my branch drew many comments. Some of the folks in our neighborhood, the ones from Ireland, would nod knowingly and smile. To them, Maeve would simply say in her lilting voice, "That's my raggy tree. She's not a hawthorn, but she'll do just fine." People who'd come here from other lands, and there were many of them, would frown at the rag, or even reach up to remove it. Maeve would warn, "Don't you be touching my wish now." Patiently, again and again, she would explain how in her old home, leaving wishes on a raggy tree was a time-honored tradition. Now and then, people would ask Maeve what she wished for. She'd tell them the truth with a sigh and a wry smile. "Nothing much, just someone to love with all my heart. Nothing much at all." Sometimes people would laugh, sometimes they would roll their eyes. "A wish on a rag won't bring you love, dearie," they would say. But usually, people gave Maeve a kind smile, a squeeze on the arm, a knowing nod. And then they too would ask if they could add a wish of their own. Another year passed. As May neared, I found myself hosting more scraps of fabric than budding leaves. Squibbles tried to steal a few fabric strips to line his dray, the nest made of leaves and twigs high in one of my forked branches. I explained he'd have to stick with moss and pine needles until the 1st of May. Wishes, according to Maeve, could not be touched until after May Day. Then, the ones that weren't carried off in the wind or dragged to the ground by the rain could be removed by people, or by enterprising squirrels. I suspect she made up that rule for my benefit, so I could grow unfettered without the weight of wet rags dragging me down. Just before dawn on the 1st of May, a young woman approached me. She had dark, wavy hair and wore a tattered gray coat. In her arms was a wrapped bundle. "Psst," Squibbles whispered to me. "Here comes another wish, Red." But Squibbles was wrong. There was no wish. Swiftly, but with great care, the girl placed her bundle in my hollow. A thank you for Maeve, I realized. A loaf of bread, perhaps. The girl had probably been one of her patients. She was gone as quickly as she'd come. Like a hummingbird, I thought. There, then not there. Like a gust of wind. Chapter 35. Just a few minutes later, Maeve opened the door of the little brown house. She smiled at me and at the scraps waving in the early morning breeze. And then came the cry. Wail was more like it. Coming from me? Not the meek peep of a wren chick. Not the squeak of a mouse pup. No, this was a cry of righteous indignation. This was a baby. The baby had a note attached to her blanket. Haltingly, Maeve tried to read it out loud. "Italian," she murmured. Only later, when she consulted one of her patients, did she understand its meaning. "Please give her the care I cannot. I wish for you both a life of love." The baby's hair was black. Maeve's was red. The baby's eyes were brown. Maeve's were blue. The baby was Italian. Maeve was Irish. They were made for each other. Maeve named the baby Amadora, which meant, in Italian, the gift of love. Many in the neighborhood didn't approve of an unmarried Irish woman raising an abandoned Italian baby. People talked as they will, and they tisk-tisked as they must. Some people were even angry. They said hurtful things. They told Maeve that Amadora didn't belong. They told Maeve she and the baby should leave. Maeve merely smiled, held Amadora close, and waited and hoped. On dark nights, when hope was scarce, she would sing an old Irish tune mixed with a newer Italian song that she had learned from a neighbor. The melody was sweet. The words were silly. The effect was always the same. A smile from little Amma. Sure enough, the longer Maeve waited, the kinder people grew, and before long, Amma, as she came to be called, was as much a part of our messy garden as all the rest of us. When Amma was old enough to feed Squibbles and his family, she did. When she was strong enough to climb me, she did. And when she was ready to make wishes of her own, she did. Amma grew up steady and honest and kind, like her mother, and had babies of her own, and then grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Eventually, Amma and her husband bought the little brown house and the one right next to it, and painted them blue and green. Years later, they purchased a house across the street and began to rent the blue and green houses to other families. The family grew and prospered and argued and failed and loved and laughed. Always and forever, the laughter kept them going. And when Alma's grandson had a little girl, he chose a fine Italian name for her with a fine Irish middle name, Francesca Maeve. As for me, my reputation grew. Hadn't Maeve's wish come true in the heart of a wish tree? Didn't that mean anything was possible? Of course, his squibbles often reminded me I'd had nothing to do with it. This isn't a fairy tale, Red, he would say. But people are full of longings, and decade after decade the hopes kept coming. A blessing and a burden it had been. All those wishes, all those years. But everyone needs hope. At long last, I stopped talking. Once the words had spilled out, it was like trying to stop the wind. In the silence that followed, I felt as if the whole world was holding its breath. I'd broken the rule. Stephen and Samar had stared open-mouthed at me. They looked as rooted to the ground as I was. Neither had uttered a sound while I told my story. The front door to Stephen's house cracked open. "Stephen," called his father. "What in the world are you doing, young man?" Stephen leapt to his feet. Here I come, Dad. Night, Samar." "Night, Stephen," she said. Stephen dashed toward the porch, but stopped halfway. He spun around to look at me. "Thanks," he said in a quizzical voice, using the same tone he might have used if Bongo had just made him pancakes. The door slammed behind him. Samar stood, holding her blanket to her chest. "I know I must be dreaming," she said. She headed to her own porch and eased open the door. "I just wish," she added with a smile, "that I didn't have to wake up." And that's it for today. Thanks for joining me. More Wishtree tomorrow. Bye.